Hello, my name is Rebecca Field, and I'm the Director in Language Education Division of Caslam Publishing. I'm really happy to be here with you today to present this webinar, which is titled Creating Multilingual Professional Learning Communities. Briefly, a multilingual professional learning community is a teacher-directed professional learning community that focuses on multilingual learners, multilingualism, education, and equity for linguistically and culturally diverse learners. And we'll talk more about that throughout this session. But I want to start with a little bit of context. As we all know, these are really turbulent times right now, and we don't even know what's going to happen in the fall. Are we going back to school? Is it going to be virtual? Is it going to be a hybrid? What is going to happen with schooling at the pre-K through 12 and the university level? Well, some people say, and I would agree with this, that this kind of turbulence leads to opportunities for positive change. And so what we want to do is help teachers use this time to create teacher-directed multilingual professional learning communities where they decide what needs to be addressed in their learning community. They look at it with a multilingual lens, and they use a Caslam book or book study guide to help them be able to take action to transform learning relations in their schools. I'm going to turn now to the presentation. Okay. Let me put on. So first of all, what do I mean by multilingual lens or multilingual professional learning communities? This means a lot of different things. First of all, it focuses on multilingual learners at school. It focuses on issues surrounding multilingualism and education. It also can be used with English only or multiple languages in the multilingual professional learning community. And it can also be used by monolingual teachers who have a multilingual stance, not only by folks who are bilingual or multilingual themselves. The issues that promote multilingualism, equity for all learners, and attention now especially to the intersection between language, race, identity, and power at school, so that those of us in the professional learning communities can identify exactly what we need to target for change, and we can learn how to work together to come up with innovations and then transform our practices. You'll see what I mean. Okay, so the outcomes for today is you all will be able to organize and convene a virtual multilingual professional learning community with colleagues who share goals and responsibilities for multilingual learners. So if you are working in a team like a bilingual education team or a grade group team or a content area team, you might work with your colleagues to figure out how to take a more multilingual lens and address the needs that your students have. You're going to be able to identify a concrete focus, question, or project for your MPLC. You can get an idea about a Caslam publication to choose to get the accompanying book study guide, which will anchor your inquiry and action. And you'll be prepared to implement a flexible framework, monitor classroom practices and student performances, and use evidence to drive your decision making. And what we've tried to do is help structure your processes for this. So more specifically, what is a multilingual professional learning community? A multilingual professional learning community is a school-based professional learning community organized and directed by practitioners with a shared mission, vision, goals, and accountability for educating multilingual learners. This mission includes a strong focus on equity for linguistically, culturally, racially diverse students, and includes attention to how power relations structure learning opportunities at the local level. Some of you may be familiar with Dufour and Dufour's work on professional learning communities, and I know a lot of you may have professional learning communities already structured in your districts. Well, this is like a professional learning community, but with a multilingual perspective and also with a racial justice lens. What do I mean by this? Okay, Esther DeYoung, in her book, Foundations for Multilingualism in Education, that you can see at the bottom of the screen, talks about competing discourses or perspectives on educating diverse learners. And what I'd like you to do is, as I talk about a multilingual perspective on one hand and monolingual perspective on the other, I would like for you to be thinking about what kinds of discourses do you find in your classroom, in your schools, throughout your district, and around society. Esther calls these pluralist discourses. I'm calling it a multilingual perspective, and she calls it assimilationist practices, and I'm calling it monolingual perspective. So first of all, in a multilingual perspective, linguistic and cultural diversity is the norm. It's not a problem, it's just a fact of life, and we see this more and more in schools across the country. Languages are resources to develop. We always see all of the languages in a student's linguistic repertoire as resources to build on and to use to make connections to complex content and text that we're studying in our classes. We use guiding principles and flexible frameworks that educators can draw on and adapt to specific contexts, because those of us in the multilingual education world know that you have to be flexible. One size fits all just won't do it. We take a holistic view of bilingualism. So let's imagine that, well, I am a bilingual Spanish-English speaker. I don't have a Spanish side and an English side that are separate and separable. I have one multilingual or bilingual linguistic repertoire, and I draw on all of those resources when I'm making meaning in one language, the other language, or both. You've probably heard a lot about this. Language literacy as social practices that are structured by power relations. We have a constructivist approach to learning and teaching, where teachers and students negotiate the meaning of whatever it is that they're learning, where students bring what they already know, their prior knowledge, to the task of constructing meaning with teachers and other students in the classroom. We focus on formative assessments tied to learning and teaching in two languages, because we know that the most authentic way to assess student performance is through formative classroom-based assessments. And we know that if it's a bilingual student, we need to assess what they can do in both languages or all the languages in their linguistic repertoire, and not limit our assessment to only what they can do with half their repertoire. It's like crippling them. Additive or developmental programs, practices, and policies that favor pluralism. So these could be bilingual programs that promote bilingualism. These could, biliteracy. These could also be monolingual English medium programs, but that take a translanguaging or a bilingual stance. And then we see a focus on social justice, identity, equity, and power in the multilingual perspective. Now let's compare that. Keep thinking about what you see in your own classrooms and schools. Let's compare that to the dominant monolingual perspective that we find in schools and society. Monolingualism is the norm. Minority languages and varieties of language, dialects like Ebonics, are seen as problems to be overcome, not as resources to develop. There's a standardized one-size-fits-all approach that educators are supposed to uncritically implement with fidelity. So in other words, if you can't implement it exactly as it's supposed to be, the problem is likely with the students or with the context or something like that, rather than with the standardized curriculum, etc. There's a fractional view of bilingualism, which interestingly we see even in dual language programs, traditional dual language programs. We see that there's Spanish used or English used, and the two are always separate and separable. That stands in contrast to a holistic view that we talked about before. We see language as an autonomous code. It's an extension of this. We can focus, for example, in language development frameworks, folks focus on language, English language development in isolation of all the other languages in their linguistic repertoire, which aren't even assessed in most cases. There's a transmission model of teaching where the teacher is considered the expert who transmits the content to the students in a standardized, more or less fashion. We're moving away from this, but we still find it, especially at the secondary level. There's standardized testing in English that's not related to learning and teaching, and we've been suffering from this really, really in an amazing way since 2000 with No Child Left Behind when that first came on. We find in the dominant discourses subtractive programs where students are encouraged to give up their home language as they acquire English. In the programs, transitional bilingual programs, English medium programs, practices and policies that favor assimilation. And we also see a focus on assimilation that is colorblind, we'll hear, and that leads to inequities for anyone who isn't white middle class standard English speaking. So what I would like you to do is think for a minute about what's happening in your context. So you can use, if you're watching this webinar with some of your colleagues, you can ask each other these questions. If you're watching this by yourself, you might ask yourself and invite your colleagues that you decide to invite to the multilingual professional learning community to talk about this together. Because what we want to do is always start by building on what you know, in this case, about your context. So think for a minute. What kinds of professional learning opportunities are most often available in your district? Just think about the different ones you've had over time. What's the strength of the approach to professional learning generally taken in your school, district, and state? It doesn't have to be just for multilingual learners, but for anything that you find that you've been participating in. What kinds of virtual professional learning opportunities have you participated in? I mean, we know that everybody had to go online for the spring semester and had a kind of crash course in virtual learning. But I'm just curious what kind of professional learning you have already in this area that you can build on. Right now, are your teachers and administrators collaborating as teams in ways that improve instruction and outcomes for bilingual learners? And what assumptions about teaching and learning are reflected in most of your professional learning? And I'm going to go a little bit slowly with this. Do you find a multilingual focus and perspective, like we just talked about, or do you see more of a monolingual perspective? Do you see a racial justice lens? Are people starting to ask in your district right now, what can we do to ensure that Black Lives Matter, to ensure that Black and brown students get equitable opportunities? Is your professional development classroom embedded, focused, and sustained over time so you can really transform the practices that you're doing? Is it practitioner driven, who really know what's best about, know most about what's happening in the schools? Is it inquiry based with your own questions and evidence driven? So if you want, now's a good time to turn off the webinar and talk with your colleagues about these particular questions and see what you have to work with. What we find, one of the things I found in my research in dual language bilingual programs, as well as my reviews of bilingual programs all over the country, is that there is no one coherent discourse that we find throughout a school, throughout all the classrooms. What we usually find is competing discourses. So think about this in your context. In some places, we might see monolingual discourses, and in other places, we might see multilingual discourses. For example, let's say you have a dual language bilingual program that's a strand in your school. You might have relatively coherent multilingual discourses there in your strand, but when you talk about curriculum development and policy for the entire district, there's a conflict. And so what I usually think of is conflict and controversy on a good day. I see this as an invitation to further professional learning. What Esther DeYoung, in the same book that I mentioned before, talks about, based on a review of international and national programs that work with multilingual learners around the world, 4 principles for multilingual schools. Number 1, the most important, striving for equity. Number 2, affirming identities, linguistic, cultural, racial, socioeconomic, whoever you have in front of you there, gender. Promote bilingualism to the greatest degree possible, which of course is going to depend on what kind of a program structure you have. And then structure for integration, because a lot of times we find that bilingual learners might be in a dual language program, but they're segregated almost all the time from the academic mainstream. How are there times and spaces where you can have the entire school integrated and times and spaces to keep kids segregated for whatever program they're participating in ways that are equitable for all? So think about your place. Where do you find what? What can you build on? So the next thing you'll need to know, you have an idea now, hopefully, of what your professional learning has looked like traditionally and you have an idea of where you want to go with multilingual learning. And now what we want to talk about a little bit is your professional learning questions and concerns. So these are some different questions that come up and some Caslon publications that go with them that some of you might already know. The first one that we're asked about all of the time is about differentiating complex content for multilingual learners. And this can be in the general education classroom. There might be 30 or 40 or 157 different languages spoken in the district. And the gen ed teachers who are using English need to know how to differentiate according to language development levels and other factors. And this first book, Differentiating Instruction by Shelley Fairbairn and Stephanie Jones-Ville, can help with that one. A lot of people, with the increase in attention to teaching and assessing for biliteracy, that might be the focus of your professional learning community right now. And we offer two books that are really popular. Teaching for Biliteracy by Karen Beeman and Cheryl Urow. Some of you might have heard about the bridge and about bringing the languages together for cross-linguistic analysis. Another book that we have is very popular, Biliteracy from the Start, by Kathy Escamilla and her colleagues. And what this one does is it shows really what exactly do we mean by a holistic model of biliteracy and how teachers need to be assessing bilingual learners and bilingual programs using Spanish and English side by side, never one or the other in isolation. So you really get a picture of what kids can do. Some of you may know about translanguaging. There's been a lot of conflict and controversy and questions about what translanguaging means. This book, The Translanguaging Classroom, shows teachers how they can investigate how students, the language practices of multilingual learners in their own classrooms, and how they can draw on those resources and on a translanguaging pedagogy, which they explicate throughout the book in ways that level the playing field for multilingual learners. Interdisciplinary Biliteracy, this is a new book coming out in the fall, and this is in Spanish. I'm really excited about it. It's called La Enseñanza en el Aula Bilingüe, and this shows teachers how to create interdisciplinary units of instruction that focus on content, language, and biliteracy in bilingual programs, primarily in Spanish, but using both languages side by side. There's been a lot of interest in special education considerations for multilingual learners because folks get confused about, is this a language difficulty or a learning disability? How can we make decisions about what's best for our multilingual learners who seem to be having learning difficulties? And we also have approaches for teaching multilingual learners who struggle with literacy and more. And as I'll tell you a little bit more about later on, we have book study guides that multilingual professional learning communities can use to ground and structure their professional learning. It's kind of like a gradual release of responsibility approach that we're giving, is helping teachers use our books by giving scaffolds like the book study guides and also directions so that teachers can take on more and more responsibility together in their group and then as leaders in the school, in the district, in their classrooms for change. So we're very interested in a cycle of continuous improvement. We don't believe in one-size-fits-all professional learning, nor do we believe in one-shot professional learning. What we believe is that this comes from the book Transforming Sanchez School by Raymond Isola and Jim Cummins. This is a cycle of continuous improvement. First, we want our MPLC's members to assess their needs and identify their opportunities. And together you could do this best rather than some scripted professional learning opportunity from outside. We want you to be able to set goals and specify outcomes for your professional learning as well as for your students. We want you to plan and design a framework, a flexible framework, and each one of our books comes with a flexible framework that you can adapt to use in your context. We professional learning community can implement and monitor progress, and then each of the sessions you come back to work, you can share evidence of student learning or of classroom practices, reflect on it with your colleagues, and then decide how to take action and what new needs you might have. we believe in the MPLC is practitioner-led learning. This is a really important part of all of this. It could be focusing on the classroom level. So you might have teachers and paraprofessionals and teacher leaders and coaches really focusing on a question about practice. It might be how to use a differentiation strategy. It might be how to implement Spanish and English side by side during your literacy block. So these are classroom levels. We also have questions at the instructional programming level. So for example, you might be wondering, what's the best kind of a dual language program for my target population? How should we make sure that teachers have the structures in place to be able to use the classroom strategies? Because you know how sometimes when you learn a new classroom practice or classroom strategy, you find out that, wait, this doesn't fit in our program structure. We have to make some changes to the program structure as well. And then you might find out that as you're wanting to make changes to classroom practice and instructional programming, that you need more professional learning because you've never had the opportunity to learn about something. And this is where the Caslon books and the book study guides come together for you. How can you use our resources to structure virtual professional learning? I'm trained as a sociolinguist, and I've done a lot of ethnographic research in schools, and I've worked a lot in the field. What I really am interested in is how can teacher leaders and teachers and administrators become agents for change? How can they read something in a book, apply what they learn to their own classrooms and programs, reflect on implementation during their MPLC meetings, use examples from their own classroom practices to guide their conversation, use peer feedback to strengthen classroom and program implementation, and share your learning with key constituents at school and the district and throughout the community. So it's very evidence-based, but it's evidence that teachers have decided reflects what students can do with the new strategies that they're learning, the new activities that they're doing, so that the rest of the community can say, wow, look what happens when you look at both Spanish and English side by side. Look what happens when you bring in the home languages as resources for learning in this English content area classroom, etc. And what you can do is, in order to use the book study guides, you can identify a professional learning need, an idea for positive change, and a relevant Caslon publication. And when you order 10 or more copies of a book, we'll give you access to the associated BSG. And then you can either use the book study guide now in PDF format, you know, and you could just use Zoom, or in August, we're going to have we're going to launch a virtual professional learning platform for the book study guides that teachers can use remotely. They can use hybrid, they can use also in face-to-face, whatever way you want. What we're trying to do is be as flexible as the times demand so that you can learn about what you need to learn about to address the needs of the learners in your classrooms. Okay, thank you very much. I hope that this is our value proposition. I hope that you have some ideas about multilingual professional learning communities. If you have any questions about anything, please just send us an email. We'd love to hear, because we're just launching this for the first time. And we will do our very best to respond to your questions as we go. Thank you very much for your attention. Bye.